The master got his slave pregnant and denied her until he saw the baby's eyes. This is not just a story about power, it's about the one truth a man with everything couldn't control. He thought he could bury what he did, silence who he hurt, and walk away untouched. But one look at the child he swore wasn't his would shatter everything, and he never saw it coming. He was a man of land and legacy, the kind of man who walked through his fields and expected the earth itself to bow. His name was known in every corner of the county, not for kindness, but for power, for control, for the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice to be obeyed. To the world, he was a pillar of discipline, a man who commanded respect, owned land, and shaped the lives of everyone beneath him. But behind those polished boots and silent stares was a man who refused to look at the ugliness he created. One night, when the moon was too tired to shine and the house too silent to soothe, that ugliness turned into a choice that could not be undone. He forced himself on her. Her name was Ilara, a quiet girl, barely more than 20, but her eyes held a lifetime of things she was never allowed to say. She had done everything right, spoke when spoken to, worked until her hands blistered, swallowed every injustice with a bowed head. But that night, she couldn't run, she couldn't speak, and she couldn't refuse a man everyone else called master. The next morning, the sun rose like it always did, but something had changed. She carried a secret inside her now, a truth growing stronger every day, no matter how badly he wanted it buried. Weeks passed. Her body changed. Her face grew tense. And though the others could see what was happening, no one dared to name it, because to name it would mean saying the truth out loud, the truth that the master had crossed a line no one was allowed to draw. One morning, Ilara couldn't silence it anymore. She stood before him, trembling but unmoving, one hand resting on her belly as if to protect it from the shame hanging in the air. "I am pregnant," she said. Those 3 words didn't just fill the room, they shattered it. The master stopped. For the first time in a long time, someone spoke to him without fear in their voice. He didn't like how it sounded. His silence was heavy, dangerous. Then his voice came out like a strike of thunder. "That child is not mine." The words were sharp, bitter, spoken with the kind of certainty that didn't need truth to feel powerful. He didn't look at her, didn't touch her, didn't blink. He simply turned away, as if turning his back on her could erase what he'd done. "You're lying," he said. Louder now. "You're trying to trap me, shame me." His voice cracked with something that sounded like anger, but underneath, it was fear. The fear of being seen, the fear of losing control. He leaned in close, his breath cold, his eyes colder. "You will not speak of this again. Do you understand?" Ilara didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just stared back at him, her body shaking, but her voice steady enough to answer, "I understand." But even then, the master was not finished. "If you tell anyone," he said, his voice like a blade, "I will have you sold. You won't see this place again. You won't see that baby again. Don't test me." Ilara stood there, carrying the weight of his voice and the life growing inside her. There was pain in her eyes, but something else was there too. Something stronger than fear. Resolve. She didn't threaten him back, because she had nothing left to threaten with. She just turned and walked away, holding her belly like it was the only thing left in the world that belonged to her. The master watched her leave, watched the truth walk out the door, and believed that he had buried it. But the thing about truth is, it doesn't die just because you refuse to name it. And the life inside Ilara was growing. Every day, every hour, becoming more undeniable by the second. The lie was set, the denial complete. But the moment Ilara gave birth, everything he built would start to crack apart. 9 months passed like the slow turning of a storm. Each day, Ilara grew heavier not just in body, but in burden. Her back ached, her walk slowed. The nights became harder, the whispers sharper, the eyes on her colder. And through it all, the master said nothing. He refused even to look at her, as if by ignoring her he could erase the truth, pretend she was just some broken servant who had fallen out of line. But no matter how many times he walked past her without a glance, the fear inside him grew larger, darker, and closer. Then one night, under moonlight that felt too quiet to trust, the pain hit her like a wave. It was time. She labored in silence, with only 2 other women to help her. No one ran to the master. No one knocked on his door. He made it clear this child was not his concern, and so the house followed his example. The screams were muffled, the sweat cold, the world spun between agony and prayer, and then a cry. Sharp, fragile, like a small knife cutting through the night. The baby was born. Ilara held him in her arms, shaking with exhaustion, sweat and tears mixing on her skin. The women cleaned and wrapped him, but there was a strange stillness in the room. No one spoke his name, and no one said the word everyone was thinking, Master. The boy was small, too small. He looked like he might not make it through the night. His breathing was faint, his skin pale. Ilara stayed awake, singing softly, praying over him with every breath she had left. And when morning finally came, when the sun rose and the house began to move again, she looked down at her son, and he opened his eyes. They were not her eyes. They were not the eyes of the men who delivered him. They were not the eyes of any other slave or servant on the land. They were icy blue, clear as winter, the exact color of the master's. It was undeniable. A child born in silence had inherited the loudest truth of all. By noon, the whispers had already begun. 2 servants saw the baby and froze. One made the sign of the cross. Another looked around before softly saying, He's got the master's eyes. It spread like wind through wheat. By evening, every slave knew. By morning, the neighboring house knew. By the end of the week, so did the master. And when he finally went to see for himself, everything changed. He stood in the doorway, cold, stiff, righteous, like a man about to look upon something beneath him. Ilara sat in the far corner of the room, cradling the child. Her face was tired, but her eyes were fierce. She did not stand. She did not bow. She waited. The master stepped closer. His boots scraped against the wood. He pretended to be unmoved, but as he drew near, as he looked down at the child, the child looked back, wide, unblinking, with eyes too clear for a lie to hide behind. The master's breath caught, his jaw clenched. For a moment, the world around him disappeared. No voices, no title, no power. Just a boy, with eyes that mirrored his own. It was as if the truth had grown a face and was staring straight into the soul of the man who tried to bury it. The master turned away sharply. He pressed his palm to the wall like he needed to hold himself up. His voice didn't come. Nothing came. Not denial, not anger, just silence. Because deep down, in a place no one was ever meant to see, he knew. And Ilara knew he knew. She watched him struggle with the truth. Watched the weight of what he'd done finally land on his shoulders. The truth wasn't just a burden, now it was alive. It breathed. It had eyes. And though the master walked out of that room, the truth followed him. Everywhere he went, he felt those eyes. In the mirror, in his dreams, in the silence of his own home. He wasn't just a liar anymore. He was a father, and nothing terrified him more. But little did he know, this was only the beginning of his unraveling. Sleep abandoned the master. He would close his eyes, and the boy's eyes would open inside the dark, cold, unblinking mirrors with no mercy. He would rise before dawn, walk the corridors like a ghost in his own house, and still they followed. Those eyes, that truth. He could command men, but he could not command silence inside himself. He tried to bury the moment in a coffin of routine. He rode the fence line. He counted sacks in the storehouse. He watched rows of cotton stand like an army waiting for orders. He told himself that if the fields obeyed, then the world still did. But obedience outside could not drown the rebellion inside. Whispers sharpened. He felt them before he heard them. A line of backs stiffening when he passed. A conversation that ended too quickly. A woman who turned away just a heartbeat late. Overseer's greetings grew careful. Even the hounds watched him like they understood something their master didn't want to admit. What he didn't know was that rumors do not travel. They sprint. By the third morning after he saw the boy, a trader from town greeted him with a smile too thin. "Fine weather," the trader said. But his eyes said, "I heard." The master nodded and walked on, jaw locked. He could crush a rumor with a look, he told himself. He could grind it down with fear. He had done it before. He would do it again, but this was just the beginning of his nightmare. Because the truth did not live in a mouth. It lived in a child. Elara kept to the corner house, the one with the warped window and the crooked door that stuck in humid weather. She rose before the sun and boiled water, rocked the baby with one hand while stirring a thin porridge with the other. She hummed songs under her breath, pieces of melodies her mother once whispered to ward off evil in a land that had never been kind. The child clung to life with a stubbornness that brought tears to the edge of her voice. Some days he was strong enough to fuss and fight the blanket. Other days he lay quiet and too warm, lips cracked, breath short, as if each inhale was a hill too steep to climb. On those days, Ilara's heart grew claws. Fear is a mother's enemy and her fuel, both at once. One evening, wind pushed river air across the fields and the heat broke. Ilara looked down and saw the fever glisten across the boy's brow like glass. His small chest hitched. His eyes fluttered open, those winter blue eyes that didn't belong in summer, and then rolled back with a soft, terrifying sigh. "El," whispered a woman at her door, "you want me to fetch?" "No." Ilara's voice was iron wrapped in cloth. "No," begging. The woman's mouth trembled. "He's the master. He's a man who said this child ain't his." Ilara didn't raise her voice, but the steel inside it spread through the room. "I will not give him the power to deny him twice." But the boy's breathing grew shallower, as if the night itself were taking its share. Ilara soaked rags. She cooled that too-hot forehead and prayed with a fierceness that could split stone. She would not let the child go. Not after carrying him through whispers and threats. Not after standing in front of a man who would rather risk God's wrath than his own shame. The master learned of the fever by accident, if such a thing as accident still existed for a man hunted by his own choices. He stepped into the corridor and found the cook whispering with the housemaid, their voices low and frightened. "Hush," the cook said, eyes flashing toward him too late. "What?" the master asked, voice dry. "Are you whispering about?" Silence fell in a heavy cloth. Finally, the maid whispered, "Her boy." No names, no titles, just her boy. But the space between those two words swallowed the room. The master returned to his office, a room that had always obeyed him. Ledgers stacked, quills aligned, leather chair worn in all the right places. It felt suddenly like a courtroom where he stood accused. He lifted a ledger, set it down, lifted it again, as if the numbers might build a wall between him and the sound of a child struggling for air. He told himself, "It isn't mine." He told himself, She lies. He told himself, I owe them nothing. But the boy's gaze cracked each sentence in half. Those eyes did not ask questions, they delivered verdicts. He opened the drawer with a hand that did not feel like his own. From its back corner, he pulled a tin of medicines, quinine bark, a leaf someone's grandmother swore by, a bottle purchased in town with a label that promised miracles and delivered luck when it wanted to. He set them in a cloth bag, then stared at the bag as if it might leap up and carry itself across the yard. No one must see him. No one must know. He waited until the hour when lamps burned low and human courage burned lower. He crossed the yard and slid into shadow, like a thief in his own life. The night insects sang too loud, too bright, like a chorus that knew his sins by name. At Elara's door, his hand hesitated on the wood. He remembered the last time he had crossed a threshold to her. He remembered the power he wielded like a whip. He loathed the memory and the man who had made it. He loathed the weakness that brought him here now. He didn't knock. He left the bag on the stoop and vanished into the dark. Inside, the child moaned, small and heartbreaking. Minutes later, a neighbor found the bag, as if Providence itself had dropped it from the night. "Elle," the woman whispered. "Look." Elara saw the medicines and went still. She turned her head toward the door, her gaze hard, thoughtful, suspicious. Pride spoke up first. "We don't need charity from a man who won't say our names right." Love answered louder. "Take it." She took it. Through the long midnight hours, she mixed measured doses and prayers, wetting the child's lips, easing the heat, waiting for any sign. She counted heartbeats with her fingers, like a shepherd counting stars. 10, 20, 50. The boy's breath stumbled, steadied, stumbled again, then caught a rhythm that sounded like life, choosing to stay. By dawn, the fever broke like a spell. Elara sagged against the wall and let the tears come. Relief is loud when it has been denied a voice. It rattled through her bones. The boy slept, cheeks warmer now with the good kind of heat, lashes damp against skin the color of toasted grain. When he finally blinked awake, those winter eyes looked at her without fever's fog, and the world felt, for a precious moment, possible. But the morning did not only bring relief. Morning brings mouths. By noon, half the quarters knew a miracle had walked to Elara's stoop. By evening, they knew the miracle had worn polished boots. No one said the master's name. No one had to. He heard the whispers, like hammers on thin glass. He cursed himself, cursed the night, cursed the softness that had brought him to that door. He called it weakness. He called it foolishness. He told himself he'd done it to hold the peace of his land, to keep a child from dying and igniting a grief fire that could burn through work, through order, through everything he ran like a clock. But the clock had already slipped. Time did not tick the same anymore. Every hour rang with a question he would not answer. What kind of man lets his son die to protect a lie? He could not stand the question. He could not stand the truth. So he turned to the only power he still trusted. Fear. He ordered the overseer to tighten discipline. He cut rations for a week. He made examples of small disobediences with punishments that bit and bled. He threw weight at shadows, trying to crush the shape of his shame. And it wasn't just the people who were falling apart. It was him. His temper frayed, his voice cracked at the edges, his hand shook after it struck. But guilt is a river. It finds its path, no matter how many stones you throw. The next Sunday, after the brief, hollow quiet of church, he stood on the veranda and saw two men approaching from town, the magistrate's clerk and the storekeeper, with the thin smile. They walked with the careful stride of men who carried more than news. "They've come," the cook whispered behind the curtain, "and they ain't here for tea." The master straightened his coat, lifted his chin, and stepped into the light as if light could still be his ally. He told himself he was ready. He told himself he would deny everything. He told himself that authority was a suit he could still wear, even if it no longer fit. But this was the moment he could not stop. And then came the most devastating news of all. The town didn't want his explanations. It wanted the truth. The men stopped at the base of the steps, hats in hand, eyes bright with the hunt. The clerk cleared his throat. "There's talk," he said lightly, like a man testing the ice on a river. "Talk that concerns your good name." The master said nothing. The storekeeper's smile didn't reach his eyes. "A child," he murmured, with a striking resemblance. Silence bloomed between them, thick and hot. The master felt the earth tilt. He felt the eyes again, not the child's this time, but a crowd's, a town's, a world ready to pull him from his throne. Power, he suddenly understood, is not lost like a coin. It is taken, inch, by the hands of truth. He drew breath to speak. But the words that rose in his throat were not denial. They were not anger. They were fear. He swallowed them down and let something colder take their place. "Gentlemen," he said, voice ironed flat, "you are welcome to see whatever you need to see." Because the master thought control could be performed. He thought that if he walked straight into the rumor and never flinched, the rumor would bow. He thought still that the world would obey his performance. What he didn't know was that the performance was over. The curtain had already lifted on a different kind of stage, the kind where a small boy with winter eyes dictated the scene. And as the men from town followed him across the yard, as doors opened and people peered and air tightened, the master felt it. The walls of his life closing in, the ceiling lowering, the floor rising. He was about to choke on the truth he'd tried to starve, and the next step he took would push him face first into the one place he feared most, a room where denial could not breathe. The master had always believed that control was his birthright, that the world would always shape itself to his voice. That silence beneath him was a sign of order, not quiet revolt. But everything was shifting now, and the shift wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. It was in the way people would pause before answering him, the way the cook's hands trembled just slightly when she set food down, the way conversations hushed when he walked into a room, not out of respect anymore, but out of fear of the truth. He wanted to believe it was just rumors, just the usual low talk meant to pull down a man of his stature, but the rumor now had a face, a body, a pair of eyes that burned through his defenses. Everywhere he went, eating, riding, thinking, those blue eyes followed him like a curse, and something in him knew he was running out of time. The collapse didn't come as a landslide. It came as a knock. 2 knocks, actually. Slow, measured, heavy. When he opened the door, the morning sun revealed 2 men from town, the magistrate's clerk and the storekeeper. Both wore stiff expressions, their eyes scanning his face as though it was a ledger, and they were accounting every lie he'd told. "Thought we might speak with you," the clerk began, a voice too casual to be careless. "Heard talk that concerns your good name." The storekeeper stood beside him, hands folded over his hat, smile like a blade. "Talk about a child," he said, with a striking resemblance. The master felt something jerk inside him, like a door slamming shut. He pulled himself tall, tried to step out of the moment, but the moment held him fast. "Come in," he said, not as a welcome, but as a defense. The 3 walked into the parlor, a room of polished wood, trophies, portraits, the master's carefully curated world of legacy. But none of the confidence that once lived here came to his rescue now. The walls suddenly felt narrow, claustrophobic. And the silence following the men inside wasn't reverence. It was accusation. The clerk spoke first. "We're here on account of what folks have seen." The master lifted his chin. "Rumors," he said flatly. "Not quite rumors anymore. The storekeeper replied, eyes sharp. People have seen the child, eyes like ice. Not many with that color in these parts, are there? The master's pulse thundered behind a calm mask. But he'd spent years learning control. He knew how to breathe through tension, how to twist truth into silence. Resemblance, he said, is not proof. The storekeeper didn't back off, and yet it's believable enough to be a problem. The word hung in the air. Problem. That's what they came for. Not truth, not justice, not even morality. They came to make his problem clear, a threat to reputation. And they came to see what he would do about it. Show us, the clerk said finally. Let's settle this before talk grows teeth. The master's stomach nodded. Show us. The words weren't an invitation, they were a demand, and refusing would mean guilt enough to ruin him. He nodded stiffly and turned, leading them out the back door, across the yard, toward the slave quarters. The sun was high now, beating down on a world that suddenly felt too open, too exposed. Each step across the dirt felt like a countdown. He could hear the men behind him, hear the whisper of their shoes in the dust, feel their eyes on his back, waiting, hunting. And then they arrived. Elara's door creaked open just enough to reveal her standing there, child in arms, eyes steady, shoulders straight. She wasn't hiding him anymore. She wasn't hiding anything. The master felt his heart drop and burn all at once. The clerk and storekeeper stepped up, their breathing suddenly slower as they peered into the uncomfortable truth of the moment. 1 breath, 2 breaths, silence. Then the clerk murmured, "Well, now." There they were, those unmistakable blue eyes, wide open, innocent, looking straight at them all. Elara said nothing, but she didn't step back, didn't soften, didn't bow. The master's mouth felt dry as rope. He tried to speak to regain control, but no words came. The men didn't even turn to him. They just stared at the child, and then at her, and then finally, at him. The storekeeper's voice broke the hush. "That's your blood." The words weren't asked. They were stated. Sharp, final, absolute. The master stiffened. "I deny that," he said coldly. But before he could launch into the speech, he'd prepared the speech of clean denial and careful logic. Elara stepped forward. "He can deny it all he wants," she said, voice calm like a blade pulled from warm sheath. "But not even hell can deny those eyes." Another silence. For the first time in his life, the master felt truly surrounded. Not by rebellion, not by force, but by truth, raw, visible truth he could no longer hide. He looked down at the child, at those winter eyes with summer skin, that quiet, fragile body, those hands curled into his mother's dress, and something inside him cracked open, a strange, unwelcome mix of shame and grief and longing, a hollow feeling he didn't have the words for, a piece of himself in flesh he refused to claim, but he still had power. And he tried to use it. "Elara," he snapped, "you're playing a dangerous game." "For who?" she asked. "For me or for you?" The question hit like a whip in the chest. The clerk shifted uneasily. "This matter," he said, "will not stay quiet." The master knew what came next. Not just whispers now, but papers, courtrooms, rumors expanding like cracks in stone, his name thrown around in places it didn't belong. Authority bleeding out, drop by drop. He swallowed fire. "Gentlemen," he said, forcing strength into the words, "I'll handle this." The clerk and storekeeper exchanged a look, the kind that said, "You'd better." They left, and the master stood frozen in the dirt, staring into the doorway where Elara and the child remained. He wanted to speak, but the words, every one of them, shriveled in his throat. Elara spoke instead. "You want this gone?" He flinched because, yes, that's exactly what he wanted. And she knew it. That's not how truth works. she said. "It doesn't leave just because you wish it away. It lives in him." The master turned without a word and walked away, the heat rising from the ground in ripples like mocking laughter. Behind him, two sets of eyes watched, one filled with pain earned over years, the other with a future he refused to touch. But this was just the beginning of his nightmare. Because power was no longer enough. Not against truth, not against blood, not against the eyes that wouldn't stop looking back. The master didn't sleep that night. He tried everything. Every trick he had learned over years of discipline. He paced the floor, sat still in silence, drank to numb what couldn't be drowned, lay back and stared at the ceiling until the pale cracks began to resemble maps of all his wrongs. But sleep wouldn't come. Something else already had. The child's face. It was everywhere he turned. Those bright blue eyes, unnatural here, too cold, too honest. He had seen those eyes once before in his own reflection, and now they followed him, not with judgment, but with the kind of innocence that made judgment unbearable. And innocence, he understood then, was the most devastating judge of all. The master tossed aside the ledger he'd been pretending to study. The numbers swam mercilessly across the page. The words lost their shape. The work, his refuge, his proof of purpose, had finally failed him. A father's work was calling instead, and he'd never learned how to answer it. Outside, the night settled across the estate like a shroud. Every window stared back like an accusation. Every quiet corner echoed with unspoken truths. Every step in the house creaked like footsteps he didn't want to hear. The world didn't feel stable anymore. Didn't feel like his. He moved through his own estate, like a guest, in a place where truth lived longer than titles. When morning came, the day didn't bring clarity. It brought reminders. The world moved on while he struggled to stand still under the weight of a truth too large to swallow. He tried to work. He couldn't. He tried to speak with authority, but the words felt suddenly empty, even to him. He tried to command, but the silence that followed his commands was louder than obedience used to be. Truth had wrapped itself around him like a rope, and that rope was tightening. By sunset, he was a man split in two, the man he pretended to be, and the man he feared he truly was. That night, sleep only found him through the dark side of dreams. He dreamed of a child standing at the edge of his bed, silent, small, staring. He dreamed of those same unblinking blue eyes, knowing him without knowing anything else. He dreamed of the truth he had buried and the innocence that had dug it back up. He woke, drenched in sweat. The image burned clean into his mind. By the following afternoon, the house had already changed around him. It was subtle, but everything was shifting. Not in the furniture, not in the walls, but in the people. The overseer didn't make eye contact. The cook dropped a serving tray when he passed. The housemaid didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, her voice trembled, unsure if she was addressing a man of authority or a man of lies. He wasn't sure either. Everywhere he went, he felt it, a wrongness in the air, a waiting, a tension so sharp it made even sunlight feel sharp. The truth had become a presence of its own, a shadow, a figure standing right beside him no matter where he turned. By the fourth day, he understood that denial wasn't working anymore, not inward, not outward. It wasn't protecting him. It was poisoning him. He was losing something far bigger than reputation. He was losing the last scraps of himself. And so, he made a choice. A terrible, necessary choice. He decided to face the truth. Not through power or pretense, but with hands empty, completely and entirely vulnerable. He walked the yard like a man moving toward a sentence already spoken, made his way to the small cabin at the edge of the quarters, the place he had pretended not to see. The place he pretended didn't hold a life made in shadow, made from sin, made from him. Elara was already outside waiting for him, the child resting against her shoulder, half awake, fingers curled lazily in her hair. She didn't flinch when she saw him, didn't step back, didn't bow her head. She simply stood there, holding the very thing he'd spent months trying to deny. He stopped several feet away, unable to move closer, not because of the space between them, but because of what that space held, the truth he had birthed but never acknowledged, the truth she had carried when he refused to carry anything but his name. "Elara," he said finally, and the single word broke something open inside him. He wasn't ready. She wasn't interested in waiting. "You denied him," she said. No elevation in her voice, no tremble. "When all I had was him." He swallowed and nodded, though he didn't feel worthy of even that much response. "You don't get to walk in here and undo what you did," she said. "You don't get forgiveness for showing up after the damage is done." Then her hand landed on the boy's back. A gentle touch, steady as rain. "But you do get one chance to do something real for him." She reached into a basket beside her, pulled out a folded blanket. Not an object of comfort, but a symbol of request. A plea, a demand, freedom. She said, "That's the only thing you can give him now, and it's the only thing that matters." Her voice wasn't a shout. It wasn't desperate. It was final, and something in the master's chest cracked again, this time into surrender. There were no more speeches in him, no more protests, no more distance, just truth. A truth he had finally lost the strength to deny. The next morning, he walked into his study, not the man he had been, but the man he could no longer avoid being. He set aside the ledgers full of numbers and profit and legacy, and pulled out 2 blank sheets of paper. Not for counting crops, not for tracking sales, but for granting freedom. One for Elara, one for the child. He wrote with a hand that trembled not from fear, but from the weight of truth finally let in. When he signed his name across the bottom, a strange relief filled his chest. Not peace, not redemption, but something close. It wasn't freedom for him. No, that was gone forever. But it was something that might grow into truth if he let it. When he delivered the papers the next day, he didn't speak. And for the first time in his life, silence wasn't power. It was honesty. The house stood silent, not the peaceful silence of dawn, not the kind that brings promise, but the suffocating kind, the silence of a world that has stopped listening. The master walked through his mansion like a ghost, revisiting the place where he once lived. Footsteps echoing in halls that no longer answered to him. The long dining table, polished and grand, once held feasts that declared his wealth, roasts stacked high, bread still steaming, crystal glasses catching fire from the chandelier above. Now it looked abandoned. Dust scattered beneath the morning light, like ashes from a world burned down. The chair at the head, his chair sat pushed back, crooked, the symbol of a man who left in the middle of his own story. He walked past it. He had no appetite for illusions now. Outside, the fields rolled wide and golden, smooth as a painting, and twice as unforgiving. Cotton still rose from the earth, rows of white that once filled ledgers and pockets, but they also held something he didn't see before: the silhouettes of people moving slowly, deliberately, no longer shrinking under his gaze. The master wasn't being avoided. He was being seen and judged. He walked toward the tree line where the shadows cut deepest, and just beyond it, where the sun warmed the grass, he saw her. Elara, sitting beneath a wide cypress tree. One hand supporting the baby in her lap, the other brushing gently across his brow, not as though he was fragile, but as though he was cherished. The child's soft curls were growing in now, just enough to catch the light. The master could see his tiny fingers outstretched, grasping at the morning air, as if even he felt something new was coming. For a moment, the master just watched them. There was a softness there he had forgotten the world could hold. No words, no rules, no fear. just a mother and her child existing in a moment that didn't belong to him. He stepped forward. The grass bent beneath his boots, each blade whispering under the weight of a man who finally felt heavy. Dirt clung to the threads. His coat felt wrong on him, stiff, foreign. Every button looked like it was holding something broken inside. Ilara didn't look up at first. The child did. Slowly, the way dawn turns itself toward another day. Those blue eyes. He stared at the master the way a boy stares at a stranger, innocent, curious, unbothered. Not impressed. Not afraid. The master opened his mouth, but no sound came. Not yet. Ilara finally glanced up, her eyes calm now, quiet, unshaken. She wasn't surprised to see him. Maybe she always knew he'd come back one last time. "Why are you here?" she asked. Not harshly, just plainly. The master's throat tightened. The words were there. Every regret, every cowardice, every nightmare. But they sat like iron locked behind his teeth. He swallowed. "I don't know how to fix what I did." She didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't offer to ease the guilt he'd earned. "That's because you can't," she said. "Not all things that break can be rebuilt. Not all wounds heal clean." Her voice wasn't angry anymore. That was the worst part. She wasn't fighting him now. She was done. He took a breath, slower this time, more honest. "I know he's mine," he said, voice trembling like a thing learning to stand. "I know I denied him. I know I denied you. I know I chose pride and fear over everything that mattered." Ilara didn't look away. She didn't look angry, or emotional, or pitying. She just listened. "And I want—" He paused, swallowed, tried again. "I want to give him my name, and my protection. What's left of it." Silence. Then Ilara exhaled slowly, like a burden was passing through her body, one she'd carried alone for too long. "You think that's what he needs?" she asked. The master didn't answer. Because he didn't know. Ilara shifted the baby in her arms, stood up, and took one small step toward him, not close enough for touch, just close enough for truth. "He doesn't need your name," she said. "He needs a life where he doesn't have to earn worth from a man who could throw him away." Each word was a sharpened stone, placed exactly where it belonged. "He needs to grow without your shadow. He needs love that isn't begging to be recognized. He needs dignity that isn't borrowed. He needs freedom." The master's chest caved inward. Truth had weight, and it was crushing. "I signed the papers," he said softly, voice nearly gone. "Both of them. Yours and his. You're free now." "Officially." Ilara closed her eyes, just briefly. Not in relief, but in acceptance. "Thank you," she said. But it didn't sound like gratitude. It sounded like closure. She turned to leave, but then paused, looked down at the child, and quietly brushed her thumb across the curve of his cheek. The boy blinked up at his mother, then turned those winter eyes one last time to the man who had given him life, but no warmth. One beat. 2 beats. Then came the moment that would haunt the master forever. The child's lips parted. His voice was soft, curious, still touched with the innocence of someone untouched by hate. "Free?" he asked. The master's breath broke. That single word from a child who didn't even understand the weight of it split him open in a way punishment never could. Not accusation, not fear, just truth. From a voice that had no reason to lie. Ilara lifted her son higher onto her hip and finally turned, walking toward the path she'd always deserved to take. The master felt every step they took, like echoes inside his ribcage. The morning light settled on his face, harsh, burning, honest. And as they crossed the field, slowly disappearing into the horizon, the master fell to his knees, not because he was weak, but because he had never truly stood for anything until this moment. He watched them go, watched the only real truth he ever knew walk beyond the reach of his land, and for the first time in his life, he didn't try to stop it. Because he finally understood, he never owned them. He only ever owned the lie. And as their silhouettes vanished from the world he built, one thing became eternal. The master didn't lose control. He lost the illusion that he ever had it. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. Not quiet like a resting home after a long day. Not the quiet of fatigue or peaceful aftermath. This was a different quiet, a hollow one. A silence that seemed to seep through the walls, crawl along the floors, and settle like dust on every unused surface. It wasn't just the quiet that hurt, it was the weight of what the quiet meant. The master stood in the grand dining hall beneath the tall ceiling and heavy chandelier. Once, this room had hosted long feasts, filled with voices that echoed like music off the walls. Candles burned, crystal glasses clinked, and every seat at the table told a story about power, wealth, and belonging. Now, the chairs were empty. The plates were set for no one. The dark chandelier didn't glow, it just hung there, like a crown over an empty throne. But it was the chair at the head of the table that finally pulled at him. His chair, stiff, ornate, polished to perfection. A chair meant for a man who commanded a room. Now, it felt less like a symbol of power and more like a symbol of absence. The master walked toward it slowly, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the space. He placed his hands on the back of the chair and felt the cold wood against his skin. This was his place of authority, where he once issued orders without fear of contradiction, where he believed the world would always bend before him. Now he couldn't even bring himself to sit, because the truth was no longer outside this house. It was in it. It was here. It was everywhere. He walked away from the chair not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't bear to claim it anymore. His hands trembled slightly as he reached the doorway, gripping the frame as though he needed help standing, though he would never admit it. He wandered through the house like a stranger, room to room. Places he used to pass through without a second thought now held a strange and bottomless emptiness. The library, where he once read to distract himself from the uneasy truths buried beneath the estate. The parlor, where he had sipped whiskey and laughed with other men like him. The front room, where slaves were sold, appraised, or chastised without a flicker of remorse. Remorse was everywhere now. In the carpet, in the walls, in the furniture that refused to be just furniture anymore. Everything had a memory, everything had a voice, and none of those voices were silent now. He paused beneath a large portrait of his father, stern, proud, forever staring forward as though he was waiting to be worshipped. A man who had taught him where power came from, how it was held, and how it was used. But the master wasn't looking at the portrait with admiration anymore. He was looking at it with a question that had been growing heavier every day. If this was what legacy looked like, what kind of death did truth leave behind? He felt his throat tighten. Something burned behind his eyes, but he swallowed it. Not out of pride, but out of habit. A lifetime of swallowing was hard to unlearn. It was the hallway upstairs that finally brought him to a stop. Photographs and paintings lined the walls. Men in suits, men on horses, families posed without smiles, a lineage of power. Men who built fortunes off the labor of others. Men who passed down land and wealth like promises without ever passing down humanity. The master stared at the nearest frame, an image of himself, much younger. Sharp jaw, sharp eyes, sharp ambitions, the kind of man who knew exactly what he wanted and never apologized for how he planned to get it. That was the same man who had buried the truth of a child, the same man who had denied a woman her dignity, and the same man who now stood alone with nothing left worth defending. He turned and walked into his bedroom. The place that used to be a sanctuary, a place for rest and power. The bed was unmade, blankets twisted, pillows thrown to the floor. A bottle sat open on the dresser, still half full, though he couldn't remember the last time he had taken a drink. The mirror caught his reflection. He stopped. He didn't look like himself anymore. The jaw wasn't as sharp. The eyes had lost their fire. The shoulders didn't carry certainty, they carried weight, the weight of a truth too long denied. He lifted a hand, touched the glass, just above where his own heart would be reflected. "Who are you now?" he whispered, not to himself but to the ghost of who he had been. There was no answer. Just silence. And silence was honest. He let his hand fall and closed his eyes, long enough to feel the truth settle in his bones. He had not just lost control, he had lost himself. The next morning, the sky opened into a soft blue with streaks of grey. The kind of morning that felt half alive, like the world hadn't fully chosen whether to become light or stay in shadow. The master was standing by the window when he saw it. The cart. Old wooden wheels. Mud along the sides. A brown horse in front. Slow but steady. And sitting on the back, a woman and child. Ilara, her back was straight, her chin lifted not in pride, but in strength. She held the boy close, wrapped in a blanket he was slowly outgrowing. His small fingers had curled around an edge of her sleeve, a gesture of comfort and belonging. Belonging? Something the master had taken from both of them. He walked to the door slowly, not to stop them, but to see them, to bear witness, to face the thing he had created and the future it was taking with it. Ilara didn't look his way. She didn't need to. She was free now. That was enough. The child, though, the child turned his head, looked toward the house with those same winter eyes. He didn't look curious. He didn't look afraid. He just looked. A look that held no hatred, just truth. Truth in its purest form. The master stood there, holding the doorframe, watching the cart roll forward, and he felt something collapse inside. Not fast, not loud, but piece by piece, like a structure that finally can't hold itself up anymore. He didn't call out, didn't move, didn't ask for forgiveness. He knew that silence spoke better than any apology. As the horse pulled the cart toward the main road, the boy lifted one hand as if reaching toward something or someone. The master felt the gesture hit him like a final blow, a reminder that even in departure, the child was offering more grace than he ever had, and that was the worst truth of all. He didn't walk back inside right away. He stood on the porch, as if time itself had paused, as if everything he had built was finally recognizing the one thing it could no longer hold. A future. When he stepped inside, the house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a shell, a tomb of decisions, a monument to everything he could no longer defend. The silence came back, stronger now, pressing against him like a presence. But he didn't run from it this time. He walked straight into it, because there was nowhere left to go. And nothing left to hide behind. Not power, not position, not denial, only the truth. And the truth wasn't done with him yet. The morning after the cart vanished beyond the trees, the master woke to a house that felt older than its bricks. Dust floated in angled shafts of light, drifting like slow snow through rooms that had forgotten laughter. He dressed without thinking, shirt, vest, coat, and then stopped halfway down the stairs, arrested by a thought that arrived like a hand on his shoulder. The ledgers. He found them where they had always lived, lined like soldiers on the lowest shelf in his study. Leather spines, neat labels, a life quantified into rows and columns that never bled. He lifted one, and it fell open to a page where names were not names at all, just entries beside weights, yields, and costs. The handwriting was his, precise and merciless. Every flourish of his pen felt like a scar he had carved into someone else's skin. He read until the ink became a blur, and the blur turned into faces. He saw a woman marked as loss due to illness, and remembered the winter she vanished from the yard as if the cold had swallowed her whole. He saw a boy tallied as reassigned labor. He'd been 14, with a laugh that survived punishment. He saw Ilara listed in terse loops of ink, like the truth could be squeezed into a line and left to dry. His hands began to shake, not with rage, with recognition. He gathered the ledgers, all of them, against his chest. Paper thudded like heartbeats. He carried them out, back past the kitchen garden to the ash pit, where cook fires died each night. He stacked the books in a neat tower and stared down at them, the way a priest might study an altar he no longer believed in. A match flared to life with an eager hiss. He held it above the first book and waited for his courage to catch up to the flame. Then he dropped it. Dry leather resisted, then sighed. Paper curled, black at the edges, then leapt into bright confession. Numbers surrendered first. Names followed. Smoke rose like a sermon he had never deserved, old sins unspooling into sky. He stood in the heat until it pricked his skin and watered his eyes, and still he didn't step back. He wanted the fire to take everything the pages remembered that he had tried to forget. But this was just the beginning of his penance. By noon, the overseer found him standing over the ash, suit smudged, face lined, gaze strange. The man cleared his throat, cautious. "Sir," the master didn't look away from the last book, collapsing in on itself. "No more whips," he said, the words flat and final. No more nights worked past, dark. No more sales. The overseer blinked. "And if they refuse? Then I've earned the refusal." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The overseer stared like a man watching a river change direction. "You'll ruin yourself." The master almost laughed. "I already did." Word traveled faster than the smoke. In the yard, men and women paused mid-task, hands on hips, eyes turned. Some crossed themselves, some didn't move at all, as if movement might break whatever spell they hoped they'd heard correctly. The estate shifted, not in sound but in pressure, like a storm breaking its promise. He moved through the day as if through water, slow, deliberate, lungs learning a new way to breathe. He took down the auction flyers tacked on the pantry wall. He told the cook's boy that the door to the front of the house was his to walk through. Without permission or fear, he walked the fields at sundown and spoke to men whose names the ledgers had crushed to a shorthand. He said their names aloud, each one like a confession. Some looked away. Some did not answer. One old man with a back bent into a question watched him long and hard, then said, "Too late don't mean never." The words hit like a mercy he hadn't earned, but the town wasn't ready to let him change without consequence. That night, as lamps watered the road in pools of gold, 3 figures came up the path, men in good coats, hats pulled low, the smell of tobacco and judgment arriving ahead of them. "Evening," the storekeeper said, scraping mud from his boot with the edge of the step like he owned the wood. "Heard you're making adjustments." The magistrate's clerk stood beside him with his thin smile. Behind them, a young planter with red ears and new money narrowed his eyes as if squinting at a stain. "Bad example," the young one muttered, Set's tongues wagging. The master stepped into the doorway and let the light frame him. There was a time when this threshold amplified his presence, made him the horizon line other men measured by. Now it merely revealed him unarmored, tired, steady. "If wagging tongues are the worst of it," he said, "I'll call it a good season." The storekeeper's gaze flicked toward the yard. "Word is you freed her," he said. "Her and the boy. Word is right. Word is you aim to free more." "I aim to stop lying," the master said. "Freedom seems the only honest language left." The clerk's smile cooled. "Careful. Men have lost land for less. Then let the land choose a better man." Silence stumbled, then steadied into threat. The young planter spat into the dust. "You'll break the county," he snapped. You'll turn order into chaos. Order, the master said softly, was chaos wearing a fine coat. They left with their warnings folded into their pockets like knives. He watched their backs disappear, felt, for once, no urge to defend himself. He was learning a new arithmetic. Every step toward truth made room for consequence, and he would not barter again. But consequences come not just from enemies, they come from the faces we once called our own. His eldest son returned at dawn 2 days later, jaw clenched like a door frame. He stood in the study doorway but did not cross it, as if the floor had become a river neither of them could afford to fall into. I heard, the son said, about the ledgers, about the rules. Yes. You think it fixes anything? No. Then why? The master's hands opened and closed at his sides, as if clutching invisible rope, because a man who spends his life building a lie should at least spend what's left tearing it down. His son's eyes softened, then cooled. They say you freed her, he said. Her and the boy. I did. The young man nodded once, an almost imperceptible admission that acknowledgement and acceptance are not the same thing. And what of us? He asked. Of the family that still bears your name? The master could have spoken then of legacy, of inheritance, of land spared and land lost. Instead, he answered the only way the truth allowed. I am trying, he said, voice raw, to become a man you could respect, if not now, then in a life you live far from this house. His son's throat worked around words he didn't say. Respect, he managed, starts with not hiding. You hid. I did. You denied. I did. You still might. I won't. A long pause stretched between them, thin as wire. Then the son stepped back, as though the room itself had made its verdict. I'll be in town, he said. If you need me. Right. The last word sounded like a truce tossed across a ravine. The master nodded. I will, he said, and meant it. Days lengthened. The air fattened with heat and rumors. The estate adjusted to a new gravity. Some workers left for family elsewhere, clutching coins he pressed into their palms with hands that had finally learned how to open. Others stayed and tested the edges of this strange permission, lingering at dusk, singing at work, looking him in the eye without flinching. It was not forgiveness. It was something like weather changing. First a scent, then a breeze, then a sky you could no longer predict using old calendars. Nights were harder. In the small hours, his mind returned to a road beyond the trees, to a boy on a cart whose first word had been free. The word echoed until it shaped the ceiling into a question, until it turned the mattress to stone. He rose once and walked the lane where the wheels had cut their shallow scars. At the bend where sight disappears, he stopped and listened to the dark. No voices, only crickets stitching the night together. He whispered to the emptiness, one day, and started the long walk back. He began to empty the house of trophies. He took down the hunt scenes where antlers crowded the sky like a forest of dead trees. He wrapped the porcelain that had survived every party and every quiet cruelty and set it in crates for whoever wanted beauty without memory. He stood for a long time in front of the piano and laid his palm on its closed lid. No one had played it in years. It felt like a secret he had kept from himself, music inside a body that refused to open. Then came a letter with Elara's name on it, but not in her hand. A woman from the river settlement wrote in careful script, telling him Elara had arrived, that the boy was well, that they had a place near the water, where willows trailed their green fingers, and shade was gentle in the afternoons. Do not come. The letter finished simply. This is to ease a conscience, not to feed a hunger. He read the line again, and let it settle exactly where it belonged. Still, he wrote a reply he would never send. It said only, I will spend what life I have left learning the Christing language of truth. If that means silence, I will speak it. The next Sunday he went to the small chapel he had avoided since he learned the art of avoiding. People shifted on the pews as if the wood had grown thorns. The preacher's eyes found him and skittered away, then returned and held fast. The sermon was on Zacchaeus, a man who climbed a tree to see the one thing he couldn't reach from the ground he had bought. The master listened with his hands open on his knees, palms up, as if they might catch whatever fell. Afterward, the preacher approached. "You look like a man who's seen himself," he said quietly. "I look like a man who didn't and now can't stop," the master answered. The preacher nodded. "Then keep looking. Long as it takes. Don't blink." He didn't. That evening, the master carried a stool to the edge of the ash pit and sat as the sun braided itself into the horizon. Fireflies started their slow grammar in the grass. He thought of how he had measured worth his whole life in acres and compliance, and the weight a name could carry, and how easily the smallest life had thrown that scale to the floor. A pair of blue eyes had rewritten his mathematics. He murmured into the warm, quiet half-prayer, half-pledge, "Let the rest of my days add to what I subtracted." But the world tests vows. A week later, 2 riders brought a notice, a convening of local owners at the town hall to discuss the matter of his recent decisions. He folded the paper with care, as if gentleness could alter its content, and went. The hall smelled of varnish and old smoke. Men filled the benches, their faces weathered into certainty. The magistrate presided with the tired air of a man who believed history could be filed and stamped. "You have disrupted practice," he said without preface. "I have stopped sinning," the master replied. A rumble went through the room, some scoffs, some startled laughter. The young planter with the red ears, he was there, bright with grievance. "You shame us," he said. "I cannot shame you," the master answered. "Only truth can, and it doesn't take orders from me." The magistrate's gavel tapped wood. "Enough poetry. There are laws." "Then I will meet them," the master said. "But I will not meet my son's eyes with lies any more." Silence again. This one longer. The old men didn't soften, but they studied him like a puzzle that refused to finish itself. When the session ended, they issued warnings and calculations, and he accepted them the way a penitent accepts ash. Without argument. Without flinching. On the steps outside, a woman he barely remembered approached Gray at the temples, back straight as a fence post. She had worked in his fields a lifetime ago and been sold downriver before he learned her name. "I heard about the ledgers," she said, voice low. "Wish someone had burned them before they learned to write." "So do I," he said. She searched his face for the joke and finding none, nodded once. "Keep burning," she said, and disappeared into the crowd. That night he returned to the study and found one book the fire had missed, tucked behind a box of sealing wax, thin as a sin a man hides from himself. He opened it. Not a ledger. A journal. His father's. The first page began with a sentence that could have birthed him. "We keep what we can name." The master read until the lamp ate all the air in the room, until his father's script became thorns, and he closed the cover with a gentleness that surprised him. He carried the journal to the ash pit. He hesitated only once. "Your son is trying," he told the darkness, "to learn how to be what you forgot to imagine." Flame took the old words without ceremony. He watched until the night was starless with smoke. He slept for an hour and woke with the road in his chest again. He dressed plainly, no coat, no vest, and left the house before dawn. The world silvered and soft. He walked, not toward the town, not toward the hall, but toward the bend where the cart had turned, and the trees had swallowed Ilara and the boy. He stopped where the ruts had faded and the grass had made its quiet repair. He stood a long time, hat in hand, the sky pinking like a bruise healing. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say that the wind hadn't already learned by heart. But when the sun lifted, he did a small, human thing. He knelt. He pressed his palm to the earth as if checking a fever he could do nothing to break. He whispered, "Grow," and let the word go down into the dirt. On his way back, he passed the cypress where Elara had once sat, singing. A scrap of blue thread had caught on the lowest limb, fluttering like a stubborn note. He didn't touch it. He simply stood beneath the tree and let the shade claim him for a while. When he finally stepped out, he felt smaller in a way that didn't hurt. He returned to find the cook waiting with a folded slip of paper. "From town," she said. He opened it. A single line, unsigned. Saw a boy by the river tossing stones. Eyes like winter, laugh like spring. He closed the note and held it like a coal that warmed without burning. Back in the empty dining room, he took the head chair at last, not to command it, but to surrender it. He drew a small knife from his pocket and carved, under the table, where no guest would ever see, a handful of names the ledgers had tried to flatten. Not many, just enough to make wood remember what paper had betrayed. When he finished, his hand ached, and his heart felt slightly less like a locked door. Dusk slid into the house like a tide returning. He lit no lamps. He sat on the porch while the world unstitched itself into crickets and wind. Somewhere far off, a child laughed, a brief, bell-bright sound carried by chance. He closed his eyes and let it find him. He knew the road ahead would be narrow and long and lonely. He knew there were men gathering words, like stones. He knew some wounds would never scar over into anything but tenderness. But he also knew this. The lie was dead, and the eyes that killed it were alive. And that life had set him a task. He rose, went inside, and took up clean paper. Not ledger paper. Not lists. Just blank, unlined white. He wrote a sentence and then another, each one an act of labor he had never learned to value. He did not write to explain himself. He wrote to make a map for the man he refused to stop becoming. Outside, the last stars woke. Inside, his hand did not stop, because what he didn't know the day he saw the baby's eyes, but knew now with the certainty of fire and river and dawn, was this. Power had never made him a man. Truth had.